thank you for being here. I have been looking forward to this for months. So what listeners should know is that we connected actually through Titanic Talk, the podcast that we've both been on with Nelson and Alexandra. And it started just as Titaniacs, kind of talking and connected on Instagram, as these things tend to happen. And I've been so excited to speak with you. And I know listeners are going to gobble up everything that you have to say, because you have such wonderful experiences and expertise in working at Titanic Belfast and being in the Titanic community. So the first thing I would love is if you would just introduce yourself, let listeners know who you are and your connections to Titanic. Just kind of spill your Titanic story a little bit.
Yeah, of course. And well, thank you so much for having me. And congratulations again on your ranking in the podcast world. So, gosh, where to start? I suppose I should start with how Titanic entered my life, which is a very actually simple and boring story, which is just that my friend and I, who were terrors together, our friend's mum on Millennium New Year's Eve just couldn't deal with us anymore. Shoved us in front of the TV, and it happened to be just the shot of the ship splitting in two in James Cameron's Titanic. Mm-hmm. And that was it. That was me. That was 6 years old for the rest of my life. So thanks for that. So it kind of like evolved from there. So I discovered slightly unusual things, like it sank on my birthday, that my 18th birthday was 100 years to the day that it sank. All these kinds of...
Oh, yeah, I remember hearing you say that on the other podcast. Yeah, that's kind of incredible.
It's slightly weird. And what's weird is that I found that out after I began to get involved. And it was actually my brother who a while later, just turned and went, I think I've just realised something really weird. And I was like, what? And he was like, I think Titanic's 100th anniversary will be your 18th birthday. A very strange kind of dinner conversation.
Realization, yeah.
Yeah. But that's sort of where it began. And then I was really, really into cinema. So I worked in a cinema at the time. In the UK, it was the busiest cinema in the UK. And so I was working there when Titanic was re-released in 2012. So you can be rest assured that no one got tickets for anything else when I was on box office. Just like, why would you go and see anything else when Titanic's out? And so my kind of passion for Titanic grew, I guess, through the film to begin with, and expanded out past that. So I remember trying to lobby my history teacher in high school to put Titanic on the agenda, and he was very dismissive. I remember that very clearly. And it grew to the point where I obviously went to visit Titanic Belfast as a guest first, and loved it. And I thought, surely I've got to work there. So I applied for a job there. I got it, which was amazing. And I moved there and worked there. And I was really into Titanic before working there. And actually, it's a slightly strange experience working in a place that you really love. So it's, people go, oh, you worked in a cinema, that must be like the dream job. And you think, well, actually, no, it really is not.
No, my sister worked at a cinema for 6 years in high school and college, and she has PTSD. Like she doesn't like to go to the theater anymore. Yeah.
In a cinema, let me tell you, see some stuff. That's if you ever do a podcast and work in a cinema, let me know. I've got some.
Oh, we should do that as a bonus Patreon episode. Yeah.
Oh, there's some stories. But yeah, so it was slightly odd, kind of working in Titanic Belfast, where it's kind of become your job to talk about this thing that you really love, and so it was a slightly strange dynamic because you are now kind of bound to work and deal with this subject even when you don't want to. And even, we all love Titanic, but there are even times when we think maybe we should just dial it back a little bit. Mm-hmm. And you can't, because you're there all day, mm-hmm. the rest of it. But yeah, so and that's how I ended up kind of working at Titanic Belfast, and that was I miss it desperately. I've moved on. I now run my own PR agency, which specialises in sort of non-profits and charities and progressive politics and that sort of stuff. It's all kind of feel-good stuff for me, basically. But I miss the kind of the daily dose of Titanic. And I miss Belfast enormously.
Mm-hmm. I've only been once, as my listeners know, but I fell in love with it, and I I had the experience of just, coming in to Belfast. We drove in, we crashed for the night at the Hotel Titanic Belfast, and which is of course in the old drawing offices of Harlan and Wolff, and then we wake up and we just walk across the street, right into Titanic Belfast. And so I think I'm very lucky. I had just the absolute perfect way to experience it. And we had nothing else on our agenda but just to be in Belfast for 3 whole days. And we did the nomadic, and then we're wandering around, got a pastry, and, and just taking in the sights and the sounds of Belfast. And I would love to hear from you, just to start, what was life sort of like there, working there? And I know you've told me you got to work with James Cameron and Robert Ballard a little bit on events there. So whatever you can share, that you're allowed to, but I know listeners would love to hear a little bit of a slice of life of what it was like to work there. And then maybe if you have any anecdotes you can share about getting to work with them, that would be amazing.
Yeah, of course. So, I mean, I actually lived in Titanic Quarter. So the kind of, they're called the Arc apartments, those flats that you will have definitely walked past. They're kind of like the sort of, the arcs that arced around.
I think I know what you're talking about. Yeah.
Yeah. All the shops and kind of cafes and things at the bottom of it, the Premier Inn.
Yeah. We went to a couple of the little cafes. Yeah.
So I lived in those flats, so I literally just stumbled out of bed and into Titanic Belfast. But you can imagine for me, whenever I gave someone my address, I always made sure that my address was like the apartment number. I was like, Titanic Quarter. I live in Titanic Quarter.
Just so you know. That's amazing.
So I remember when I got the job, I was like, I'm not living anywhere else. Like, I don't care if I have to beg, borrow, steal. I'm living in Titanic Quarter. But yeah, I mean, I loved it, and actually working at Titanic Belfast, it's funny that I look back now and I see it more as a privilege than I realized at the time, because I now know so much more about Belfast, Titanic's history, and how competitive it is to work somewhere like there and kind of be involved in that. And I think. Mm-hmm. As I've kind of engaged more with the Titanic world, I mean, I've always been into Titanic, but it's relatively recent. I've kind of got involved in Titanic, kind of speaking about it publicly, like the article I've done and speaking on podcasts and things. Mm-hmm. And I realise now actually how many people are so envious of me having that job, and I kind of didn't really consider that at the time. But no, I mean, Titanic Belfast is a fantastic experience, and I think hopefully many of listeners will go there and we can talk specifically about it a bit later. But I think, I mean, yeah, so I did do some events with Robert Ballard in particular, actually. So I was listening to your episode the other day, you were talking about when you went to the hotel and you had the, drawing room on the right as you go in. So we actually did, before they renovated that hotel, which I was very dubious of. When they told us about those plans, I was like, oh, God, it's going to be really commercial.
I can understand that. I know that, and we'll talk about that. I know, there's mixed reactions in Belfast about some of this, but I have to say, and I know it's a privilege to have been able to stay there, but it's a really good hotel. Like, they did a really beautiful job. Yeah.
It's really, really stunning. And the wonderful thing, you alluded to it actually also, is that room on the right, the drawing office one, is open to the public. So you can just go in there and you don't have to buy anything, you don't have to stay there, you can just go and see where Titanic was designed, you can go to Thomas Sand's office and all the rest of it. But we did an event with Robert Ballard in that room before they renovated it. And there's some fantastic photographs I've got of him in this room, and all the paint is peeling and it's just as it was. It just had not been touched. I speak about this a lot, how crazy it is to me that Belfast, it's relatively recent that they have embraced Titanic and the way that they have, or in any way, really, but truly in the scale that they have now. And the drawing office is an example of that, where it was just sitting there, this incredible, I mean, Nomadic is the same, I heard you talking about Nomadic and the life it had as like a disco and all these kinds of things. arguably the world's largest Titanic artifact,
Oh, just the closest that someone could
Yeah.
get to being on Titanic, touching her. I mean, it's when you walk. I obviously have told my listeners if you can afford to get to Belfast immediately, but the nomadic is. I mean, that's it. That's the Titanic thing that I think is the closest to feeling physically connected to the ship. And I'm so happy that it didn't get destroyed. I'm so happy we still have it.
and amazing, really. I mean, it's the only White Star Line ship left, and that whole thing is so amazing that all of these things are quite recent. Even Nomadic actually was not there when Titanic Belfast opened. It was a later edition. And it took the kind of success of Titanic Belfast for people to go, okay, right, clearly the Titanic thing is still alive. The fire is still there. So it was amazing to me how much of this was just left there. But anyway, so we did this event with Robert Ballard, and it was really. I mean, it was amazing, as you can imagine, for a Titanic kind of not like me to be able to work with him and meet him. And I think
is he received in Belfast as sort of like a king coming home? I mean, is it? I imagine, because I know he's been really instrumental in Belfast sort of re-embracing its Titanic legacy, right? So when he gets there, I imagine people go crazy, probably.
Yeah, so Robert Ballard he's a really good friend of Titanic Belfast, and actually we can talk a bit about this when we talk later about the artifacts and things like that. But I think he and Titanic Belfast really align on the kind of how Titanic should be remembered and its kind of legacy. And so he was always really, he was actually really helpful in the beginnings of Titanic Belfast and kind of getting the story together and how they were going to present that, and the sort of memorialization versus commercialization, and that kind of fine line, which I know we'll talk about.
There's a lot to talk about. A lot. Yeah. Buckle in for 17 hours. No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah. This is an extended episode, right?
Yeah. Special edition, part 1 and 2. Yeah.
But yeah, so he's really well received, and I think he is particularly well received because he understands the really tricky relationship that Belfast has with Titanic. And I think that is always the first thing whenever anyone talks to me about Titanic or asks me about it, or when I'm interviewed, whatever it is the first thing I say is that you really have to understand, or at least appreciate, the context in which Belfast and Titanic work together, because it is not like anywhere else in the world. And yes, there are 35, I think, actually, at the moment, Titanic exhibitions, museums all around the world.
It's a lot.
Yeah, there are tons, and some of them are in places that mean something, and some of them are not. But there is nowhere like Belfast that has that connection. I think you have to kind of appreciate that, and I think Robert Ballard got it immediately. Actually, to be honest, from when he found the wreck, I think he got it straight away. But it does mean that he has this relationship with the city and with Belfast that is, I think, there is quite a profound sort of sense of respect on both sides for that relationship. So yeah, he's a bit of a rock star when he goes back.
And what about Cameron? Is he? Because I know, in terms of the sites of memorialization, the museums or traveling exhibitions or house museums, whatever. I mean, there's a post office in North Carolina that has Titanic memorabilia, because I just did an episode about there's one North Carolina connection, and since I just moved here, it was my Patreon bonus episode this month. But he was one of the postal workers. And so the post office in his tiny hometown in North Carolina has Titanic memorabilia. So it just, there's, like, as you say, there's so many places, but I know that some of them are divided on whether they forefront the film and Cameron or what, I mean, obviously the museums in Pigeon Forge and Branson forefront it a lot, like they've chosen that, and some go the other way. But how is he in Belfast? Is it the same? Is he sort of a rock star? Like, do people, connect? Are they grateful to him for, what the movie has brought to memorializing Titanic, or is it more of a mixed kind of reaction?
Oh, this is an endless conversation that I have had with multiple people. It's a lot more mixed. So
Okay.
I should say from the outset, as you can see, but your listeners will not be able to see, I am a big fan.
Oh yeah, I should just say that you've got a beautiful setup behind you. Two of the no, it's gorgeous. Like it's how I want my office to look. So he's got gorgeous Titanic posters, beautifully framed. You've got actually three like lined up perfectly on the wall, and it's like a perfect backdrop for doing an interview. But no, I think you and I are super fans of the movie. I mean, it's obviously it's no secret to my listeners, and yeah. So you personally, it's your favorite film of all time, right? I mean, it
is objectively the greatest film of all time. No debate.
I agree.
I will not have a end of conversation.
Yeah, and no, I have gotten into this argument at dinner parties, at a bar. I mean, and then you mix a little bit of like wine in, and people go crazy. But yeah, I've had this debate with many.
I just started dating someone recently, and my housemate was like, "Just keep Titanic out the first day." Keep out the first day, and I was like, "We'll see."
Yeah, well, it's funny. My husband, if he was sitting right here, he would probably say the same thing, that I think I like let it seep in slowly. I mean, it definitely was. I was not on the first date, screaming about it. I would say within a couple of months, we had a conversation where he realized like, oh, okay.
There's the moment you can see where they go, oh, okay.
Oh, yeah.
Straight out, like, this is a thing.
This is like part of your personality. And for me, and my listeners know this, Leo, also a part of my personality. My phone case is Leo, as you can see. I'm showing this. My people on Instagram have seen it, but my husband he realized pretty early on, he was in a relationship with me, and also with Titanic, and also with my obsession with Leo. So I feel it. Yeah, but I feel, but it's good to like let it seep at first, but then you do have to let them in on the full.
True to it. And listen, when they step in my house, I mean, it's the same. Like, there's no more hiding. Like,
no, you've got it. Once it's like you're making dinner at your house, they need to know by then. Yeah. So, anyway, I interrupted you, but so you were going to preface what you're saying by mentioning like you are a super fan of the movie.
So I don't want anyone to be, I mean, no one that knows me will be under any illusion otherwise anyway, but yeah, big fan, greatest film of all time, etc., etc. And when I moved to Titanic Belfast, I don't think I quite appreciated the, well, I know now in hindsight that I didn't appreciate the, again, quite tricky relationship that Belfast has with the film, and in particular Titanic Belfast. And I was quite kind of gung-ho about it. I was pretty clear that I thought it was, the greatest film. And not only that, though, that it is responsible for the kind of rebirth of Titanic, which I stand by. I do think that the public interest in Titanic was reignited. I mean, beyond reignited, had a rocket put up it, because of the film, because of James Cameron's film. And I think in Belfast it's just a little bit more sensitive, and I think they struggled whilst I was there to embrace the film fully, and it was often quite a heated debate actually about whether they should. And for a long period of time, I know you'd visited just quite recently where it's not quite as obvious, but they didn't mention the film for a very, very long time.
Oh, okay.
And we were actively sort of steered away
from talking about it.
Yeah. And I know you spoke recently, I don't know how recent it was actually because I'm kind of out of sync, but with someone who works at the Branson and Pigeon Forge Museum.
Oh, yeah.
And he was talking about how people, get really upset when they find out that Jack and Rose are not real. And that happened all the time. It happened all the time. And
I know it did, because and I will say, and, now that I know you, this all fits even more into place. But I will say Titanic Belfast, anyone that works there is fantastic. I mean, the staff and the docents and staff, everybody that is working there is educated about everything they need to be, so eloquent, so sensitive to questions anyone has, takes the time to answer them. And it's an amazing, it seems like an amazing, group of people that they've assembled. And we did one of the walking tours as well around the quarter. And yeah, and our guide was fantastic. I wish I could remember his name. I can't, but he told me that he recently had a couple come through, and they genuinely thought that the entire museum had been built because of the movie, and that they did not know that Titanic was a real ship. And I don't know how someone ends up in Belfast, Northern Ireland.
I mean, so I had a lot of people saying, where's the heart of the ocean, and what about Jack and Rose? And I remember one family had to break it to
their children, probably.
And they were really, really upset that it wasn't real. But I've never had anyone come and say that the ship wasn't real. I mean, that's. No,
he said he had to go to the restroom, so take a moment. He said I had to leave. My brain started breaking, so he had to go like, oh, excuse me for a moment. Yes. I guess maybe, I don't know if he needed to laugh or cry in the bathroom, but yeah. So and then also on. My kids are Titanic'd out. I fully understand that I'm going to have the two children that are, they're actually going to be anti-Titanic because they've had to, unfortunately, that's probably what's going to happen. We always rebel against the things that our parents like. But when we were there, the guide was not, I do think they talk about it a little bit more, it sounds like, than when you were there. So he did, when we were on the outline of the ship outside, the steel beam in the ground, and you can see where it laid in dry dock. At the bow, he did say, does anybody, let's get it out of the way. Does anybody want to come and do the pose? And my son, he's going to listen to this like 10 years from now and be so embarrassed, but he just thinks because his mommy is who he is that he has to do that, So he was 7 at the time. 7 at the time, and so he raises his hand with this look of just anger on his face, like, oh, okay, I got to do this. And so he stands there, puts his arms out, and just looks miserable. And count to about 5 seconds, and the guide's like, okay, that's good. And Robbie's like, okay. And he loves me though, and he was going to stand there for as long as I needed him to stand there to get the picture and for him to. It was so cute, but yeah, I think they do. I think they're open to questions. They never are angry when the questions come in because they know that the movie brought so many people to the story, and like you said, I think there's an appreciation for the awareness it brought.
It's definitely changed, and I go back every year for my birthday. So since I've left, I go back every year for my birthday, and I often go back. And I went back to Titanic Belfast this year, and obviously I'm still in contact with a lot of people that work there, my friends and things. And it is true that they have embraced it much more. It was when I was there, I was trying really hard to get them to kind of see that perspective, and I was trying to kind of put forward that position of, listen, it may not be ideal, but it's just the case that film had such incredible appeal that is the kind of gateway to as a broader subject. And it is slightly strange that you go round this experience, which is otherwise extraordinary and so true and authentic to Titanic's story, but actually misses out an enormous part of Titanic's story. And whether you like it or not, one of the things that I just find endlessly fascinating about Titanic is that it just doesn't go away ever, and it is just always in the news. There is always a new film or a new TV show or a new documentary, a book, whatever it is. And it was strange to me that they had managed to completely kind of miss that. They've rectified that. And
yeah, there is an exhibit about the films now. Okay, right. If I'm
new. That is brand new. Okay. That's really, really recent. Because that used to be, when I was there, that was what they called the OEC, the Ocean Exploration Center, and that was just like a general gallery about kind of further ocean exploration. And they would, that was actually, they'd linked up with Ballard a lot there. So when he was out on research ships, they would stream live from his ships into that gallery. So when you were in there,
cool though. Yeah, that's a good idea. Yeah, I mean, it's I don't want to, for people that haven't been and done the full tour, I'm always hesitant. I don't like to reveal too much. I want everyone to experience it without any spoilers. I guess that's a weird word to use, but there is, Ballard is there in the exhibits. He is tied in so inextricably to Titanic Belfast, which, like you were talking about, makes perfect sense. But yeah, so they do have the gallery now that sort of goes over the timeline of the different film versions. Yeah.
So they've embraced it more, and I think they're sort of fixing that relationship. But James Cameron did launch the Blu-ray, the 2012, when they re-released it in 2012. He launched the Blu-ray at Titanic Belfast, which I saw as a kind of step forward in their kind of acknowledgement of that. And I mean, this is not to say that there is any kind of bad blood. I just think that it is just a really, really sensitive subject in Belfast. And your listeners probably know, but until Titanic Belfast opened, they basically didn't talk about Titanic in Northern Ireland. It was just not really a subject that anyone wanted to talk about. And even when they were pitching the idea of Titanic Belfast in 2008, so you're talking about nearly 100 years after this, there was still a lot of hesitancy. People didn't think that it would be financially viable. They didn't think they could pull in the numbers. They didn't know if they really wanted to do it anyway.
And there's still a mixed reaction, right? I mean, I know that, as much I know it's bringing in a lot of money, and I know just from being there myself, it's crowded. People are going. Titanic brings people in, and for anybody in the U.S. that's been to the Titanic Pigeon Forge or Branson again, for example, you wait in a long line, and these lines are there every single day, which is mind blowing. But I understand that, just anecdotally, a little bit of research I've done, right? There are people in Belfast that don't necessarily align with the use or the building up of Titanic Quarter that way, right? I mean, because it is that it becomes a market identity. I mean, if you like you said, you were living in Titanic Quarter, I would have been the same way. I would have been, every time I wrote my address down in capital letters, like I live in Titanic Quarter. For me personally, that's a beautiful, beautiful thing. But I imagine there must be some people in Belfast that, if that's not how they envision their city, I'm sure it is a bit problematic for some, right?
I think, yeah. And I think what I was saying earlier, like, you have to remember the context. And in its peak, Harland and Wolff employed over 35,000 people against a population of like 500,000 in Belfast. So you're talking about, basically, if you were working, you worked for Harland and Wolff. So this is the unique context that Belfast has with Titanic. And so it is not desperately surprising that there is an awful lot of people who still have quite a difficult relationship with it, whether they had, a family member who worked in Harland and Wolff, worked on Titanic, or, whatever it is. And so it is difficult, because until 2012, no one really talked about it. And now it is an entire identity. But if you don't mind, actually, there's a small story I want to share from Titanic Belfast. When, after I moved there, one of my friends, who's now a very close friend of mine, she said to me, maybe 3 weeks into working there, she said, listen, I just want to say thank you to you for moving here. And you don't know how much it means to us, because I work here because I believe that this building can change the face of this country. And, many of your listeners will know about the difficult history that Northern Ireland has. And she was like, I was 19, she was 20, I think. Most teenagers that age are just getting drunk every weekend. But she was like, I work here because I really believe that we can change the face of this country, that people will want to come here, they want to visit this building, they want to embrace the Titanic story, and we can be seen for something other than our difficult and troubled history. And I found I've never forgotten that moment, because it was just a very kind of powerful insight into the trauma that country has been through. And again, this is the bits of the context and the connection that Belfast has with Titanic that you really have to get in order to understand its wider relationship with Titanic. It's not just, well, we built it and it's not our fault, it sunk, There is a lot of history and a lot of pain there.
I dabbled in labor history in grad school, and one of my advisors was a very, very well accomplished labor historian. But labor history, a lot of people don't understand, is its own beast, its own, to understand the complexities of, like you're saying, what its role as a primary employer through so many years, so many decades. And then even before that, the labor history in Belfast. I mean, it's been a really important and busy, but very chaotic and often tragic place for, I mean, there's a whole history of child labor, and Titanic Belfast does a really good job in the opening exhibits of showing more of Belfast's history that's not just Harland and Wolff, that's not just, shipbuilding. And so, yeah, I mean, there's so many contexts. That's what I was blown away by when I was there, is how many contexts you can set yourself down into, just even in Titanic Quarter.
I think that's what makes Titanic Belfast unique, actually, in the wider context of kind of Titanic museum exhibitions. I think that's what makes it, Titanic Quarter, but in particular Titanic Belfast, unique in its telling of the story of Titanic, is that it isn't just, oh, well, it was built and then this happened, and they tend to get quite quickly into artifacts, quite quickly into the sinking. As you say, with Titanic Belfast, you begin with the beginnings of Belfast. You're learning about why the linen industry was so important.
Yeah, you walk in and suddenly you're learning about linens, and it takes a minute. Yeah. I mean, I'm a historian of that period, so for me, I'm in heaven. I mean, I walked in and my kids are like, "Oh gosh, we're going to be here for 17 hours, aren't we?" But yeah, I think for the average person, you walk in and you're sort of like, "Okay, wait a minute, what?" But in a good way, and then you before you even learn about Titanic, you are completely immersed in Belfast's history, which is so important, and that's what I try to do on the podcast. Is whether I'm talking about Belfast or Cove or Southampton or a place that a survivor or victim is from, like, it's understanding the politics and the socioeconomic circumstances of a place is so important to understanding the story of Titanic. It doesn't exist in a vacuum. I mean, it was out there in the ocean by itself, but it doesn't exist in any vacuum or bubble or and actually really quickly, sorry to interrupt, but it reminded me of a personal story, which is, when we were planning our trip to Belfast, we were planning our whole Ireland and England trip last summer, and it was like 18 days. It's this big journey. And my husband's father, who really all he knows of Belfast is the really troublesome history that he in his lifetime has heard about, he was concerned we were going. He doesn't know anything about modern Belfast. So he was genuinely concerned that we were going to Belfast and was genuinely concerned about our safety. And we had to explain to him in sort of a watered down version, quick version of, how Belfast has sort of evolved, and you don't need to worry. This is a safe place we're going to be, and the Titanic stuff that we were going to see. So, but Belfast has to do a lot of work to fight against this international reputation that it has as a troubled place. And it has been a troubled place, but it's also a beautiful place, and everywhere has been a troubled place. I mean, the United States is been a horrifically troubled place. Don't even get me started. So
I don't think either your country or mine can claim to have a troubled
history. Not at all. Like, a lot of my side research right now is on the history of slavery. I'm working on a kind of a side project in that realm. And I mean, I go to sleep at night after reading some of these books I haven't read since grad school. And I just turn to my husband and I'm like, what in the world? It's like everyone is awful and I'm going to bed. I don't like the world is terrible. So it has to do a lot of work to fight against that reputation. But I think, at least for me, once someone is there, I think Titanic Quarter does such a beautiful job of showing off the city and showing off the history of everything.
Absolutely. And I think, and I know we'll talk about the future of Belfast later, and I have one or two things I want to say on that, but I think you're right. And I think the kind of renovation of Titanic Quarter is amazing, actually. And in particular with Titanic Belfast, I think what I think is most impressive about Titanic Belfast is that they have got that line of kind of, as they say, the sort of remembrance versus kind of exploitation. And, it's a tricky place to be. But I think it's a lot more representative rather than kind of replicative, if that's even a word. So,
I see what you mean, though. Yeah.
Kind of these sort of four, the building itself is 425-foot bows, the same height as Titanic. And you get the reason that they're designed like that is because they make up the four areas of shipbuilding in Belfast. So you get on there wood, iron, steel, and aluminium. And so you will know, as you've been, that the outside of it is covered in these sort of silver, sort of aluminium shards, and there's 3,000 of those. And they kind of provide this sort of shimmering, very effective.
That's beautiful. I mean, as a space of public history, it's really one of the most beautiful spots I've ever been to.
And this is what I think is interesting, is that you get all of this for free. And I don't know where you've flown, but if you fly into Belfast City Airport, when you fly over Titanic Belfast, those four sort of bows are bursting from the center, and they create the star in the White Star Line.
No, we drove in, so I didn't get to experience that. Yeah, we did like a driving trip in Ireland, and then kept the rental car and drove up to Northern Ireland. But that's amazing. Well, I want to make it back soon, and I likely will be flying directly in. So now I'm excited about that. I did not know that. So
fly to Belfast City Airport, and you will also see that. So you have that kind of this sort of bursting of the star as you fly over, but around the building, you might already know this because it's on that Discovery tour that you did, the walking tour, is that the wooden benches that go around Titanic Belfast they're actually Morse codes. They spell out.
It's so cool. And everyone does such a
details.
and everyone does such a good job of our guide did such a good job of explaining it in such a a way that everybody could understand, from a tiny child to a 90-year-old. I mean, it's the interpretation is done so well, and every little piece is so meaningful. Yeah. And that actually, I think, is a great. I mean, I could talk for 10 hours just about how much I love Belfast. Like food recommendations too. But I think that's a great segue into talking about the artifacts, because, Titanic Belfast, as you just said, one of the main things it does is create a public history space that the building is a part of that. The view of the dry docks is a part of that. The benches you just mentioned are a part of that. Like, every bit of the building itself is telling the story, which is really important. There is, a lot of people may not know this, a ride that you go on inside of it that takes you through kind of gathering an understanding of how it was built. And I won't ruin too much. I think people need to experience that on their own. But in terms of that part, that's not artifacts. That is just well done public history. So in terms of Belfast and artifacts, help us understand. I mean, Belfast has a very specific policy in terms of artifacts, right? And help the listeners understand kind of what is on display there and what's not on display there, and what the museum's kind of philosophy on that is, because it is different than other Titanic places that people have visited or may have visited. So
yeah, of course. So I think, you've explained it really well there, that every bit of Titanic Belfast is part of your experience. So there is just nothing in there that isn't part of that. So, even as you go in, you'll have seen this bit, they have that big kind of rusty wall as you go in on the right, and this is all to kind of give you that effect of, this is maybe what Titanic looks at the moment. And everything is very representative, and that's what's so great. But as you say about the artifacts, so Titanic Belfast has a very strict policy, and it's I say very strict because actually it was really, I don't want to say drilled into you, but it was very carefully and sort of methodically explained to you when you go there, that this is not, we're just doing this because, this is actually really what we believe, and there is a reason. Because people do come there, and people would, a number of questions you'd get is, are Jack and Rose real? Can we see the staircase? And where are the artifacts? And so it's a question that we would get an awful lot, and still do. And it really is, it's very clear to them that they believe that the wreck itself should be left as a gravesite. And so they have nothing from the wreck at all. Everything that they have that is an artifact was either taken off the ship before it sank. So, for example, they have a first-class lunch menu that a passenger stole. It's a bit stealing, but took.
Who wouldn't have? If it was me, I would have pocketed it as well. Yeah. It's no judgment,
No. And so everything that they have was taken off it before it sank or before it sailed, whatever it was, all was found at the surface. So, for example, they've just got Wallace Hartley's violin. It's just has just appeared there. As you probably know, so his that was found strapped to his body, so he was found with that at the surface, and so and they don't have anything from the wreck. They really truly believe that that should be left undisturbed, and I think. I guess we're going into it, aren't we? So
Let's go in. Let's go in. As listeners should know, we emailed, we talked before we recorded. There is, here, I'll preface this conversation with, a couple of things, which is one, I recommend a couple of articles that you have written. One in particular that you sent me that is a great overview, I think, of kind of the artifact journey and the Titanic community. So I will, number one, make sure that that is linked in the show notes if you're okay with that, so that people can, I think it's a great primer and kind of understanding some of this. I also recommend people go back and listen to my Robert Ballard episode, because I do lay out the finding of the wreck. That episode took me a month to produce. I almost lost my mind, and I haven't done that detailed of a deep dive into a human being since that episode, because it almost broke me. But it is a really good episode about, finding the wreck, Robert Ballard's philosophies about the artifacts and that sort of thing. And then third, listeners know for the last 2 years I've been sort of skirting around the issue of the artifacts. Probably the number one question I get from people is, do you support artifacts being brought up, and how do you feel about RMS Titanic Inc.? And so we are going to jump into that conversation. I've been sort of skirting that, not avoiding, but just kind of trying to come up with the right ways to address that conversation for the last couple of years. And I think it's, as life tends to, this worked out perfectly, because I think talking about this with you, the expertise that you have, the experience that you have, I think this has actually turned into a great way to, the whole episode's not about this, but I think this has become an episode where I can finally jump into this. So do you feel, and if the answer is no, I can sort of do it, but do you feel comfortable kind of giving a 30-second primer, is a good word, to people about who RMS Titanic Inc. is, and what the general, because there are, as most of you guys listening know, there's thousands of artifacts that have been brought up from the wreck, and there are ethical questions surrounding that. But there is one organization that has, quote unquote, sole proprietorship to these artifacts and to bringing them up. And so if you feel comfortable, maybe kind of explaining who they are and how that happened, a brief summary?
Yeah, of course. Gosh, brief. I'll try and do it briefly.
It doesn't even have to be, whatever. We're already 45 minutes in. People are going to have to be deep in on this episode, so it's fine. But just a general kind of summary. I know you'll do. I just read your articles. I'm like, I know he'll do a great job of. My summary would be 3 hours, so you'll do better than me.
Crikey. Okay, pressure. So, RMS Titanic Inc. So Robert Ballard found the wreck. Obviously, we all know that. He, as you said, really strongly believes that it should be left as a grave site. He's been very, very clear about that. That's why he and Titanic Belfast have a good relationship. But part of the consequence, I use that word lightly, of him not kind of declaring ownership of it and believing that it should be left as a gravesite means that it was left open to someone else to do so. Because essentially, I'm cutting short some history here, but essentially it became a sort of finders keepers policy for a number of reasons. Because White Star Line, when they collapsed, folded into Cunard, but Titanic wasn't part of that merger because she was sort of seen as we were never going to find her. There had been a number of attempts to, and it never happened, and so she was just not part of that merger. But also, she's in international waters, so it's really, really hard to kind of establish present day ownership, if that's really the word you should be using about something like Titanic. But so there was actually a congressman who tried to put in place some kind of legislation to sort of protect Titanic. It didn't really go that well. He tried quite hard to kind of it's called the Maritime Memorial Act in 1986, but it sort of it never really fully materialized for a number of reasons which remain problematic today. But essentially, then what happened is this organization in '87 called Titanic Ventures Inc. So they will.
That's what makes it more complicated. I'm glad you mentioned that. It's because I get that question a lot too. But it is the same organization. It does change names. So that I'm so glad you're starting with mentioning that. Yeah.
So you can interchangeably. So if you hear me or anyone else using it, you have RMS Titanic Inc., Titanic Ventures Inc., and Premier Exhibitions.
That's right.
So Premier Exhibitions. Some of you guys will probably have been to their other exhibitions. They do things like they do a bodies exhibition, they do extreme dinosaurs, Pompeii, King Tut, like all these kind of things. So they do a lot of other things, but they kickstarted the first sort of salvage operation, and in my opinion, from the get-go, they had pretty questionable sort of beginning. So one of produced of reality TV, another was like involved in like dwarf tossing.
It's really is a sitcom that writes itself if you start looking at the details of who was on this first. It doesn't always sit super well. I mean, I want to be really clear that I have actually been to one of their exhibitions. In fact, actually, the first exhibition I went to as a Titanic kind of kid, they brought their touring exhibition to Manchester, and I went when I was like 9 or something. So I should be clear about that. But one of them from the very beginning was obsessed with actually cutting into the wreck to look for diamonds. I don't know why everyone's always obsessed with diamonds on Titanic, but it was unsurprisingly very controversial. So, as you probably know, Eva Hart, Titanic survivor, actually described it as a looting of a mass grave just to make a few £1,000s. So she was critical from the beginning, staunchly against it.
Yes, she made herself known. And so what followed was just decades of arguing, sort of mostly between the UK, France, and the US over who owned the wreck. But in the meantime, whilst that was going on, RMS Titanic Inc. was just going down and just taking everything they could.
And they were working with the French. They were working with the French, right? This is a French venture in many ways. I think the sub is the Nautil, and actually, it's honestly perfect timing to be doing this because the very first episode of my season is going to be a look at P.H. Nargiolet. So he's involved, he's there. And this is a complex story, and I think a lot of people that are casual Titaniacs want it to be really cut and dry and black and white, and it is not at all. There's no black and white here.
There's not, and it's also really, really complicated. It goes back really, very, very far. Actually, you just mentioned that. I mean, it goes back so far to the point where these people and organizations start to kind of get quite confusing, they merge, and it's not quite clear who did what, and it takes a long time to kind of piece it together.
And then there's been infighting as well, right? I mean, I would need a legal historian to sit down and help me with this, but you can look at some of the documents online that have been made public, but there has been infighting within RMS Titanic Inc., and they've had changes in leadership, like tearing apart of different factions, right?
That was one of the most controversial parts, actually, is that they were going down, they were taking everything they could, and essentially because of that, they emerged as the sole legal owner to the salvage rights and operations and artifacts, basically because they were the first people to go down there and take things from the wreck, which is, in my opinion, kind of crazy. A US judge did actually rule that sort of free, sort of find a keepers policy was not right, but RMS Titanic Inc. Sort of successfully argued that they needed to recoup the money that they'd spent going to the wreck and the rest of it, and they did so. They put on display 5,500 artifacts, and this is where I really this is where I struggle to hide my disdain.
Don't hide anything. The T-shirt that I sell as my merch says "Busting Open the Mythology Since 2021." So anybody, it's funny. I get reviews on Apple sometimes where the reviewer is like, well, I'll give it 4 stars because it's researched, but this woman is, and then fill in the blank. You can anything politically or activist, feminist. And I'm like, none of this has been hidden. I guess you just listened. I know. I'm like, thank you. This is fantastic. But this is a safe space. Dive in. Yeah, pardon the pun, but yeah.
they pulled 5,500 artifacts from about 30 dives, and the first place to put them on display was a casino in Las Vegas. And I struggle with that for reasons that I shouldn't need to explain. It's just random. It's landlocked. It's man-made. It's nothing to do with Titanic.
I do as well, and I haven't been. I'm not a Vegas person. I know like some people really love going. I had to go for work once years ago, and I was miserable. But I've never been to the exhibit there. I know I need to go to see the big piece, but I'm with you. I'm very conflicted.
Yeah.
It is such a random and for many inaccessible location. It's for most. It's very expensive to get there. Very landlocked. And anyway, go on. But I agree 100%. Yeah. It's just even that like gets me like worked up. Yeah.
Exactly. And that's sort of where it kind of enters public consciousness, I suppose. The ruling was kind of opposed by many people, including actually, incidentally, Titanic's former insurer. So they were like, this is crazy. What is going on? This should not be how this works. But anyway, as I say, they at the time, these artifacts were valued at over 100 million. And you're talking about, 30 odd years ago or something. So it's not surprising that they wanted to kind of keep that. But while, as I say, this argument's ongoing and they will continue to go down, take more things. But at the same time, their shareholders were really pressuring the company to be more aggressive in exploiting the wreck and to take more valuable things. This is public, there are quotes out there, this is
everyone listening should know we are not speculating about this. This is all fact up to this point. Yes.
Well, I was
100%.
Wrote that article that everything was sourced either to the original document or because it was I want to make sure that people get that this is I have an opinion on this, but this is just fact. This is fact
that we are discussing. Yes, actually.
And I have one quote that I wrote down that I want to share, which I think is quite revealing, and this is from someone called Joe Marsh, who is one of RMST's shareholders. That's RMS Titanic Inc. Okay. He said, quote, "We all know there are billions of dollars down there underwater. It's like sitting on a gold mine." And I think it kind of encapsulates, we were talking just there about Titanic Belfast and how much effort and thought went into portraying that story sensitively. And Titanic Belfast, let's be clear, is a business, right? They're making money.
Oh, of course.
Just be really clear about that. They are making money. But the way in which you are taken through that story, the detail, talking about the benches and the star, and there's so much there. That is honestly just the tiniest insight into Titanic Belfast kind of consideration versus someone who would say a quote like that publicly. I just think really,
there's a huge wide ocean between those two things. I mean, it is okay to be in the public history space and be for profit. I mean, there is a good way to do that, and Titanic Belfast is doing that. And of course, they have a gift shop. I bought things at the gift shop. Full disclosure, and my listeners will know, they see on Instagram, I buy things at gift shops. I'm not, I certainly don't want to come off as a hypocrite about that sort of thing, but there is a wide ocean between running that as a business and investing in public history and a quote like you just read, where you are admitting that the only reason you are going down there is to make money. Yeah. And that is the most insulting thing to anybody, especially anybody whose family was on board, anyone who lost an ancestor, a family member on board, their family legacy. It's the most insulting thing that I could imagine.
It's also just not true to Titanic's legacy. It's just not what the history of Titanic should be about, right? And unsurprisingly, so Premier Exhibitions, the sort of parent company, their stock soared by over 200% that year. So they were doing it, but as part of that ruling, they were bound to keep these kind of two big. So they had two big collections. And they were bound to keep them together forever. So they legally had to keep them together for public benefit and research. They were not allowed to break them up. And they were known as the American collection and the French collection.
That's right.
And so they were declared the owner, and largely that kind of debate was put to bed for a little while. It was kind of like whether you liked it or not, that was just where we were. Their exhibition went around the world, 40 million, I think they're up to now, people.
And it's, as you did, it's the exhibition that a lot of Titanic people who are, especially people that are a little, you're younger than me, and people that are like in the 5 to 10 year younger than me range, like that's their memory.
Yeah.
That is what sparked as a child their interest, was going to one of these traveling exhibitions.
Well, and everyone remember, you talk about you get the boarding card, they have the iceberg you can touch, all those kind of things. That's the exhibition. The exhibition, when people think about, as you say, that's the one they remember. You get the boarding card, you get to touch the iceberg, they have the big piece, all the rest of it. So it's, it just was what it was. That was it was largely put to bed for a while. But it was becoming kind of tense inside the company. You talked earlier about kind of change of leaderships. So there was a sort of replacement there, and someone called George Tullock, I think I'm pronouncing that right, who was a BMW dealer, really kind of randomly. He raised the big piece, so the big piece that everyone talks about, which was obviously itself. But he sort of took over. Next year, Harris, a founding member, was booted out over embezzling money. He was embroiled in legal disputes after raising artifacts to fund other kind of ventures. So he had like a reality TV exhibition. During all this drama, they're being fined by the Exchange Commission for doing dodgy deals.
And again, this is all fact. This is none of this is speculation. You can find all of this documented, and it really is. It, like I said earlier, it's like unfortunately, it seems more like a sitcom than it does part of Titanic history. It's ridiculous. It's unbelievable. It writes itself as an unbelievable story. Yeah,
it really. And then, so you spoke to someone from the Titanic, Branson and Pigeon Forge Museum. So one of the founding members, John Jocelyn, I believe.
Yeah, those are him and his wife. They're his museums. Yeah.
So he was in RMS Titanic. He sold his shares and set up those two museums. He actually said, I have a quote from him: "I worked with a lot of movie and TV people, and I've never seen so much underhandedness going on in all my life. Nobody had any scruples." And I should be clear that I also have some views on the Titanic museums in Pigeon Forge and Branston, but I mean, that says a lot that someone who was involved was so...
Oh, 100%. And and just to be clear, it's no secret to any of my listeners that I work with the Titanic Museum in Pigeon Forge because I live an hour and 45 minutes from it now, and I've done, I know, and I've done, I hosted a film festival for them, which was, I think, a great, in an academic sense, a great thing for them to sort of, start doing programs like that. And so I have worked with them. They're, a couple of people have been on the podcast, and so I think feel free to share any opinions you have as well. I mean, they know the relationship I have with them is very clear, which is this is my podcast, and having a relationship with them is just one small part of everything that I do. And they know that I am an academic, and first and foremost, my we were talking before we recorded, my loyalty is to research and to talking to people from all different parts of the Titanic community. So, they know that when it comes to them, they're not free from discussion or from, so feel free, to discuss them as well if you like. Don't feel like you have to, avoid that. I mean, they're well aware that I am aware of the whole conversation here, and there's a lot to unpack. So,
I mean, I'll stick with RMS Titanic Inc. for the moment, but I mean, they are tied into this kind of debate.
Yeah, of course. Absolutely. Mm-hmm.
But so he left, and then the exhibition continued to tour. Again, the debate kind of just simmered down a bit. But then in 2012, obviously Titanic's 100th anniversary, it automatically became protected for this this sort of international legislation from UNESCO, which kind of protects cultural and historical archaeological objects that have been underwater for 100 years. Also, in tandem, you had Titanic Belfast opening in 2012, so that became the world's largest sort of Titanic experience, really successful. And so for kind of a collection of issues, I kind of put together, there's no evidence to suggest this, but I'm sort of putting it down to this protection that kind of restricted RMS Titanic Inc. a little bit, in Belfast becoming very successful. Premier Exhibitions filed for bankruptcy in 2016. And this is where I'm already...
So it gets so interesting, yeah.
You said a fantastic quote the other day, which is that they flirted with bankruptcy, and I love that quote, so I'm going to give you full credit for that. But they wasted no time in going to court to overturn its agreement and gain the right to break up these collections and sell them off to kind of repay creditors and all the rest of it. They were initially denied this, but then they sued RMS Titanic Inc. sued the French government and argued that their agreement, so the agreement between Premier, which is again, essentially the same as RMS Titanic Inc., and France at the time of the first salvaging, required this kind of collection to be together. But Premier eventually successfully claimed that they had the unconditional right to the artifact. And they then announced that 6,000 objects would be auctioned off in 2018 with a minimum bid of £16.5 million. And you talked a little bit about this actually in one of your very early episodes about food and drink, that they auctioned off a biscuit.
Oh yeah.
And I find moments like that's just desperately sad that we lose, those things. But sorry, go on.
Well, no, I just was going to agree. Sorry to interrupt, but the minute you sell something into a private collection, it's gone. It's gone. Well, and that's the saddest thing to me is, the artifacts that have already been brought up, you can debate until the cows come home about whether they should have been brought up, but here they are. And unless you're going to put them back into the ocean, which I guess somebody could make an argument for that, I don't know. But unless you're going to do that, they have to be properly cared for. Just the idea of anything disappearing into a private collection just breaks my heart. So.
It's desperately sad, and I think what happens next is because of that even more sad. But so a huge effort was launched with National Geographic Society, Titanic Belfast, the National Maritime Museum, the National Museums of Northern Ireland, and Titanic Foundation Limited, which is sort of based in Titanic Quarter, to bring those artifacts back to Belfast. So the idea was that they actually incidentally were supported by James Cameron and Dr. Robert Ballard. If you're going to have two people on your side, that's two pretty good people.
I was about to say, they're on, that's a good, and I think it's a show for both of them. Yeah. It shows some of their character, and I'm a fan of both of theirs. Nobody who listens to this is is blind to that, but I think that does show a good part of their character as well for supporting that. So, yeah.
And so that was, they pledged together to kind of, I think they raised just under 15 million, there's 14.7 million to buy Premier exhibitions. And the idea was that they were going to host all of those as one collection, and they were going to co-own and preserve the artifacts as a single exhibit in Titanic Belfast. Open to the public, of course, that was sort of a big part of it. But they didn't meet this minimum that Premier had sort of arbitrarily set, and were excluded from the auction, so they were not allowed to even take part. And this is the bit that it's just so desperately sad that those were sold to private bidders, and we haven't seen them. So they've just. And
how many do you remember? How many were sold off to private bidders and disappeared in that?
It was about, the full collection of 6,000 went up for auction, and I think it was around 5,000 to 5,500 that went to private. So some did make its way back into the public, the violin being one of them, sold at auction at another time, that is back at Titanic Belfast. But pretty much everything that was sold at auction we have not seen.
So what is remaining because they still do own the exhibition at the Luxor in Vegas, right? So what are the artifacts that are there? Is that from that same collection, and those are the ones that were not sold?
Well, so that is the next part of the story.
Oh, okay.
So of course, the joke of the whole story is that they then survived bankruptcy.
Of course.
So they then
shocking. Yeah.
Unbelievable. So they survived bankruptcy. Their museum stayed open. Some of those artifacts stayed where they were. So the ones that were sold off at auction kind of got them out of their red, I suppose, their sort of hole. And a lot of them did then stay in their exhibitions in Las Vegas, and they still tour some of them as well. But thousands and thousands and thousands of those artifacts were just lost. and haven't seen since.
And you can't, that's the nature of
You
a
can't get it
private,
back.
it's a private collection that a private individual has purchased it and they have full ownership and control over it. And, and talk about being in an ethical minefield. I mean, to talk about it, I have friends that I've made through the Titanic community, and they'll know who they are when they're listening to this, who do have items, who have, they're collectors, whether it's things connected to the movie, which is a different story, or connected to the actual ship. And so it's, even in my own personal life, I feel like it's a minefield when I have these conversations with anybody.
The problem is that it never gets better. So you think, okay, that's terrible. Like, is there any more? Yes, there's more to that story. Like, if you can believe it, that, in 2020, they applied and won a court ruling, which
I forgot about that.
It overturned previous protection from about 2 decades previous that prevented any kind of cutting into the wreck and detaching it. They wanted to retrieve the
Marconi set.
Yeah. And they said that they wanted to put it on public display, at least for now. And they were given permission to break up the ship in the process. I know you've covered this, but those Marconi operators, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride, people talk about the heroes of Titanic, right? These 2 people stayed at their posts. When I say the last minute, I mean the last minute. They communicated with other ships. They constantly switched between, CQD and SOS that had never been used before. They exhausted every option to find, some sort of help for Titanic. And this is embodied in the final message, as you'll probably know this, which was sent at 2:10 in the morning. If you're talking about seconds.
Right before it all fell apart. Yeah.
Their final message was CQ silence. They didn't even get to finish that message because
the water was coming in. Yeah.
That was their dedication to doing everything they could. And even as I talk about it, I just I can feel myself getting angry because I just think they were responsible for Carpathia hearing their calls for help and undoubtedly help, saving 700 people that were in lifeboats. But they did everything they could until the very, very last moment. And now you have this company which is drowning. Actually not, but drowning in legal and ethical and moral controversy, and they're going to just rip into the wreck, having just organised this complete bankruptcy.
Yeah, like a fire sale, but and all while under the umbrella of the of the what the hell moment of why is this organization even given quote unquote proprietorship over something that represents the death and loss of human beings, is in international waters.
Yeah.
It blows my mind. And we were talking before recording about sort of how we would, approach this, but something just popped into my mind. I think it's so presentist. In the US, like the Barbie movie's been really big. I don't know if it's been big where you are, but everyone's been talking about how sort of wild it is that so many people in the population here need this, even basic primer on like feminism and, and that, some people argue the movie is like anti-male. And if you see the film, it's not at all. It's actually this like beautiful exploration of what it's like to be a man, a woman in the modern world and how we define ourselves. And it's not anti anything. It's just kind of pro-human. But it's, there's these funny segments about the patriarchy and it being about, horses but I was thinking about this in terms of Titanic. I think, unfortunately, a lot of the early historiography of Titanic in terms of who has been in charge of its legacy and who has been in charge of writing about it, getting to talk about it at conferences, has been almost sort of a like horses, ships, I'm a man. Titanic has been...
It's kind of encapsulated with Titanic, right? It's the old men's white club.
It's old man's white club. Yeah, exactly. And I've said it on here, and I've gotten some blowback, and if I read some of the emails I get from people, I don't know. I think people would be a little surprised, and I'm happy to get those. I mean, I'm happy to be one of many, on the forefront trying to change some of this. And I've got a strong skin, so it's fine. But I think that it reminded me of that, because I think the early part of studying the ship, after for example, Walter Lord's book comes out, right? And like the main group of people, with exceptions, are a group of white men who latch onto this story and latch onto the legacy of the ship, I think, as a very masculine thing that they feel ownership over. And, people hear me say that sometimes, and some people give me the eye roll of like, oh, please, like not everything's about that, right? But it absolutely is. And as a woman who is trying to have a place in, helping to write the Titanic historiography, helping all of us to understand and modernize how we talk about it, it is really frustrating, and I want to scream it from the rooftops, because it is completely wrapped up in these ideals of masculinity and who has ownership over this thing. And
the whole of Titanic was about it was about
exactly. I mean, of course it's that. It goes all the way back to what the ship even was, and the era, and what
the name.
Yeah. Look at the name. Literally. And so, and I've been fortunate to have wonderful people on the podcast, historians like Gareth Russell that come on and they are doing the important work of breaking down the Titanic story in terms of gender and race and class. And, but yeah, I think you can't avoid that. And when you talk about this crew of men who literally took ownership over something that you could argue nobody should have ownership of, I think it's important to just have the conversation. You gotta just you have to throw it in the middle of the table and talk about. I mean, I think for so long in the Titanic community, we've all just been skirting around talking about this, and I don't see where that takes us anywhere good. It takes us in a circle. That's all.
I think the problem with that as well is that. So I'm like a big feminist, and like one of my jobs is working for the first ever female leader of a political party in the UK here, and so it's been a big thing throughout my life is trying to kind of push forward the kind of, I hesitate to say feminist agenda because it's always tarred with negative things, but pushing forward kind of rights for women and getting them into public office and things like that. And there are lots of great men that help in that fight. In fact, you need men to help in that
absolutely
fight. I think the thing with this is that in the Titanic debate, it often isn't the case. And you look at this history of RMS Titanic Inc., which is not done, and it is just littered with men who are just not interested. They're not interested in the ship, the history, the legacy, public benefit, research, education. They're not.
A lot of them are,
that's it.
It's the bottom line. And as you pointed out, it's a lot of people in, they're entrepreneurs, they're in the business world, their interests lie there, not in the history. And, I don't know if you've read it. There's a book called Unsinkable it came out about 6 months ago by Daniel Stone, I believe is the author. And it's not really about Titanic, the ship. It's more about all of the efforts to find the ship pre-Ballard. And he looks really intricately at some of the men between 1912 and the 1970s that tried to come up with these crazy ways of finding the wreck. A couple of them claimed ownership over the wreck, even though they had no connection to the White Star Line whatsoever. And he does kind of a psychological deep dive into the psyches of these men. So anybody listening that's interested in this kind of part of the story, I recommend that book. Book has a couple of issues. He's like not the biggest fan of just Titaniacs in general. The overall tone's a little negative, but he does do a really good job of trying to kind of split open why some of these white men are, feel ownership over this wreck. And I think a lot of it is tied in with how we culturally view shipwrecks and what they represent to us. And but yeah, I think it's just part of the conversation that no one's blunt about. And I think it's just time to be blunt. And like you say, I'm not being anti-man when I say that. I think that in any community, there is room for all perspectives and you need everybody at the table. But I think, unfortunately, with Titanic, women haven't been allowed to be at the table. at all.
It's ironic
And
when you consider that all ships are female, technically. So
I know all these people they love to call her, but then there's no, but there's,
well, yeah, but men owning women is hardly a new.
Well, exactly. So they own the ship, and she's a her, and any even I'm shocked. I go to conferences, I go places, and I'll bring up. Like I was talking, I won't name names at all, but and I won't give any identifying factors. But I was talking to a woman who studies Titanic and was sharing, some things about my book that I'm working on. And then the comment was made, oh yeah, it would be great if there was, a modern cultural history of Titanic in media too, because we have the Stephen Beale book, but that's kind of a little dated at this point. It's a great book, but it just was published in, I think, 95. And I said, and my reply was, yeah, I just spent 20 minutes telling you that that's what I'm doing, and even women in this community are programmed to think that only these certain men can write these books, and it blows my mind.
But that again, I mean, history is written by white men.
Yeah, we've made very few strides with that, even, and I came out of an academic history program, so I've lived it, firsthand, and and I'm white, so I have that privilege, so I can't, I can't fully speak to every aspect of it because of that, but yeah, anyway, I feel like I hijacked your whole thing. I don't know. That just popped into my head, and I had to mention it. It seems so presentist to kind of the conversation these days.
It's very relevant because it is the people behind the operations making these kind of decisions and they're relevant. They're, and I wish that was the end actually of the.
Oh yeah, no, tell us the whole. Yeah, it doesn't end there. Yeah,
it does not end there. But as you say, mostly kind of white men creating these problems, and so they wanted to recover this Marconi telegraph machine, and there was an ongoing battle with the US government for quite a while over whether the undertaking was legal. Eventually, RMS Titanic Inc. dropped it. They blamed COVID. Obviously, the US court presumably had some kind of role in that. But, and talking about it being present and, relevant, that it was just last week on the eve of the anniversary of Titanic's discovery, RMS Titanic Inc. are back, and they are
back. God, they're back. It was on the cover of CNN. They are back to give us more controversy. Yeah,
they are re-emboldened, and they will resume this mission to get the Marconi telegraph machine. But this time, they are not going to ask for permission. They are just gonna do it because they believe they have this unconditional right to the wreck and to whatever they want. Now, this is pretty much like breaking news. That this is kind of happening.
Yeah, this is this is the last week. Yeah, this is brand new.
This was like Thursday.
3 days. Yeah, 3 days. Yeah.
So as far as I can see, where we're at currently is the US government has now launched a fresh, new kind of legal challenge to halt the expedition. But RMS is not interested. So they're planning to just go ahead and lift more belongings from inside the wreck. They said, quote, they want to recover freestanding objects inside the wreck, which could include objects from inside the Marconi room, but only if such objects are not affixed to the wreck itself. Now, you should note how carefully worded that is compared to last time's kind of attempt to cut open the wreck. Which I suspect maybe is their argument. I have no evidence for this bit, but I suspect is their argument for saying, well, we don't need permission because we're going to retrieve it without detaching and cutting the wreck, which was the basis of the legal argument last time.
Before, yeah.
So maybe that is their kind of their position now, but it is the U.S. District Court in Norfolk, Virginia. They oversee the kind of Titanic salvaging matter, and it's their latest bid to block this, claiming that buried in a pact with the UK actually is a clause to treat the shipwreck as a gravesite. And so currently RMS Titanic has not filed a response in court, But I suspect that they will likely do what they always do, which is just claim that they have the unconditional right to the wreck, that it's infringing on their rights. And so here we are again, sort of a century of protections, agreements, arguing, ruling.
And protecting who? Protecting.
Well,
yeah, exactly. And people wonder, like how, it's the best way to put this. We think, at least all I know is U.S. history is obviously my specialty in terms of any of these things, but, we talk about corporations. We talk about the history of money making in America and the corporate world, and we bemoan this, and then we wonder, of course this is how it happens. This is the day-to-day. It's happening right now in terms of Titanic. Yeah. Who is being protected? These very wealthy people that want to make more money. The wreck's not being protected, so they're arguing for their own protection, not the wreck's protection. It's wild.
Neither is the story of Titanic, actually, because Titanic Belfast has proven that you can tell the story without filling it full of artifacts. And
Thank you.
An interesting comparison here, actually. I get told off for doing this, but I wonder whether someone like RMS Titanic Inc. would be doing the same thing about 9/11. And I know that one is a terrorist attack and one is a disaster, but I think there is some comparison here in that two were like defining moments. Truly defining moments of their time, not the time actually
of their century. Yeah.
And two are terrible losses of life. But what I find interesting is that when you go actually to the 9/11 museum in New York, which I actually I thought was quite good, but it was overwhelming with artifacts. In fact, there is one bit where you get to the end and it is just like they ran out of places to put artifacts, and it's just floor to ceiling, wall to wall of artifacts. And it is one way to tell stories like this. But as I say, Titanic Belfast has proven that you can do it in other ways that are, just as engaging, if not more engaging, and certainly more authentic. And I think this is where I find this whole artifact thing so strange, because their claim publicly, RMS Titanic Inc., is that it's all about preserving Titanic's memory and telling the story and all the rest of it, and seem to completely forget that there is an entire, different way of telling that story that doesn't require such kind of... I used this quote in the article and I got a lot of... trouble for it, but in my opinion, like bandit behavior, like it is extreme.
It's giving like this is a group of people claiming that they have the quote unquote right to go in as a band of thieves. I don't, and I'll say it, and just so no one catches me, and I know I'm going to get some emails about this episode, and that's fine. But just to be clear, I do know there are women who work for RMS Titanic Inc. I'm going to get, that's the comment I'm going to get. That's the thing they're going to focus on, is someone is going to email me and say, actually, I know that there's, the head of so-and-so at RMS Titanic Inc. is a female. I know that. I was at a conference where they had sent a representative to the conference, and she was female, and so I'm aware of that. But I'm also aware of the fact that at the conference, her presence was, in my opinion, I'll say, because this cannot be fact, this is just me as a human being observing something. In my opinion, her presence seemed to be to police the situation, the talks that were happening, the discussions of the artifacts, so that they were adequately represented, not spoken ill of, because a lot of people that were at the conference want to work with them and want to be involved in their exhibitions and want a seat at their table. And now we're human beings, everybody is a human being, and people will do what they want to get where they, and I, who am I to judge? And a lot of the people involved in this, I don't know personally, so I certainly am not going to, name names or throw stones. But I think that there has been a real problem in the Titanic community, like I said earlier, of just not discussing this. Like, just have open and honest conversations about this, instead of just letting this one organization like you said, go in as the little group of bandits that are allowed to, I don't understand it. There should be way more voices and people at this table. And it just blows my mind.
I think it has basically, again, in my opinion, turned into a sort of almost like a kind of mob gang where, as you say, you get that kind of impression that you're like, okay, right, well, they're keeping an eye on what I'm saying and what I'm doing. And actually, I think, hold on, I'm not making this up. Everything I've just told you is fact. That is just what has happened. So you can make your own opinion. If you think they have behaved appropriately, have that opinion. Great.
That's right. And some people probably do. Some people would probably look at all the information we looked at and say, I don't have a problem with this company. I love these artifacts. And that's your prerogative to think that too. It's all about the information being provided.
I do think it's very interesting. We talked about James Cameron and Robert Ballard. They both backed this bid from Titanic Belfast and National Geographic to bring the artifacts back. And I think, the argument there, of course, we were talking earlier about Titanic Belfast not taking anything from the wreck, but their argument was these are now already surfaced. They're here. As you said, we can't send them back. So they should be kept in public domain.
And taken care of by, and returned home to where they arguably should reside.
Quite. So actually the campaign was called Bring Them Home. That was actually what the campaign. And Liam Neeson actually was involved as well. Did a really, really, really touching video actually about it. But it occurred to me when I was writing this opinion piece about the artifacts. I never probably thought about the relation with James Cameron in the film and things. And actually, it's kind of surprising that it's not Jack or Rose that have the final words in that film. And if you think about the very, very, very last words said in a 3+ hour film. It is 3 years I thought of nothing except Titanic, but I never got it. I never let it in. And it's that realization for him that he spent his whole career, or the last however many years in this film, searching for this kind of quick payday, get this Heart of the Ocean necklace, but he never actually got it, as in the most important part of Titanic's story, which is, of course, the loss of more than 1,500 people and the people who built her and the people who sailed on her. And when you think about it, it's kind of interesting that it kind of makes sense then that James Cameron was actually, in my opinion, I'm kind of piecing together something here, that he backed this bid of Titanic Belfast to bring this back to bring the artifacts home, because actually he's making a point there in a film that there is a bigger story here. It's not just about this quick payday thing. I mentioned earlier about
you just blew my mind. Because if I told you the number of times I've watched this movie, you might call like a psych ward. You know what I mean? Like, I don't. No. So I would say we're best friends. It's alarming how many times I've watched this movie, and it's good. It's good to know that there are other people in the world like me. I feel very seen. But I've never, as many times as I've watched it, I've never put that together. But I think what you just said is genius. It's like it's right there in the 97 movie that there is this potential profit to be made off of, whether it's literal or metaphorical jewels beneath the surface, but that at the end, the jewel goes back in the ocean, and the Bill Paxton character, who's obviously a stand-in for Cameron in many ways, he's sort of speaking for all of us, or should be speaking for all of us, and saying that's not what this is about. And then the Rose character is showing that as well, because she's kept this diamond all of these years, and only because it's connected to Jack, not for any other reason. And at the end, it just has to be returned. And it's like the return, that's the theme.
And when you piece that together, I said earlier about that quote from Joe Marsh, who said about billions of dollars under the water. If you hold that in your mind and sort of make that comparison with Bill Paxton's character, Brock Lovett, the comparisons are quite chilling, actually, in that you're talking about a film that makes this point of there is more to life than just making money and exploiting it and the rest of it. And this is why the exploitation of the Marconi operators story is so disgusting, frankly, for me.
Heartbreaking, yeah.
You're talking about two people who really, went up to the last minute to do everything they could, and you're not actually interested in that. You want to say that is the story that you're telling through this.
But that's not what you're doing. No, you're making money. Yeah.
Exactly. And the film, in just that short scene, does a better job of explaining that. And as I say, it's kind of crazy when you think about it. It's a 3-hour film where you've got these two big stars in it. It's now, 25 years later, still an incredibly successful film. So
Greatest love story of all time. Anybody can at me about that that they want. Please leave me.
They can at me as well.
leave me some of those 1-star reviews and tell me that it's not. I don't care, but it is. It's the greatest. And people get so mad at James Cameron because he sort of just accidentally wrote the greatest love story of all time. But yeah, I think it's right there. And James Cameron has been in this milieu. I mean, he was in conversation with Ballard in the late 80s. He's been in this milieu the whole time, and after he made Titanic, he disappeared for a long time, but he disappeared from Hollywood. But where he was at Titanic. He went back so many more times, and he made Ghosts of the Abyss, which I always tell people, if you're a Titanic the movie person and you haven't watched it, you've got to. But he was even more obsessed with it after he made the movie.
I think you see that kind of evolution, and I at the end of my article I write that it's a shame that RMS Titanic Inc. hasn't had its kind of the epiphany that its sort of uncanny Hollywood sort of counterpart has, because for me the moment in that film is right. I get it. Like, I have been obsessing over the wrong thing, and yet RMS Titanic Inc. is not having that moment of self-reflection. They are not, even in its darkest moments. I mean, the 2018 bankruptcy auction sham is just, it leaves me speechless, because I just think it is so outrageous what happened. Because, I mean, I don't have any proof that they were not going to go bankrupt. I think it's pretty unlikely given how successful they were previously and immediately afterwards.
Yeah.
But I just think you can debate endlessly about where you take artifacts from. Do you take it from the wreck? Do you think it's debris field from the surface? Whatever it is. I think one thing that surely we can all agree on is there needs to be legislation in place that guarantees that these are kept public, that they are accessible, they are not sold off to the highest bidders, and to keep private companies and directors afloat.
No, they shouldn't be No, they shouldn't be in someone's, enclosed in a glass case in someone's mansion and fill in the blank. I think that the ones that have made it to the light of day again, you can debate again for years about whether they should have, but if they're here, they should be properly taken care of by professionals with all the right training and expertise, and they should
question marks over that actually as well.
I know
comparisons of when they lifted artifacts and how they look today, and of course there is going to be some, they will degrade.
There's always some natural, but some
of them are quite shocking actually.
They're not. I don't think that they're being cared for properly. I don't think they're being displayed properly, and I agree 100%. I think they should be viewable by the public and in places that are accessible for as many people as possible. Like school children should go in and see them. Not, I will say, in terms of, I haven't been to the museum at Branson. I know they have a lot of similarities. I've really just worked with the one at Pigeon Forge, even though obviously they're owned by the same people. And but I will say that that's a real plus in the column for Pigeon Forge is and again, they're making money. They are a for-profit organization. So that's, one of the main things to disclose when you have a conversation about them. But they do have education programs where they, one of their goals is to get as many children in there as possible. And they have education directors that go and do school programs and things too. But I don't understand where some point this conversation became so much about making money off of these things and not about educating people about the actual event and tragedy. This is where the conversation should be, and we're just over here somehow.
I have to confess, and I needn't give my disclaimer about Titanic being my favorite film again, but I have to confess that I do think that, I mentioned earlier about the kind of memorialization versus commercialization. I do think James Cameron's film is responsible for the immense commercialization of Titanic in general.
I agree.
It is also responsible for keeping the story alive, undoubtedly. absolutely, undoubtedly. But I do think that the kind of the rebirth of Titanic as a kind of commercial venture really took a new life of its own after that film. And in some ways, that's great because it means that places like Titanic Belfast are financially viable, and that's great for Belfast. But it makes it tricky because it's hard to kind of define when you're just making money, when you're telling the story faithfully, and
and how much does the movie have to do with that? I mean,
yeah. Well, I mean,
it's a fine line.
It's a really funny example of this, right? So everyone now wants pictures on the staircase and the rest of it, and at Titanic Belfast, they do have a replica of the staircase. It's not actually in the experience, so they use it for kind of weddings and things, and they do have to be there on Sundays, and it's great and it's really lovely. But it occurred to me one day. Actually, it was on my very, very last day. My friends organised a surprise for me where they reenacted the last scene in Titanic. So they all were like lining up at the staircase and they played the music on the screen.
Oh my! Like, you have the best friends. Can I'm so sorry. If you go for your birthday next year, I'm inviting myself. Yeah, I am just going to happen to be there on your birthday so that I can be a part of this.
My birthday is actually my 30th, so I am organising like a kind of big 30th birthday at the Titanic Hotel. So you are more than welcome.
Don't toy with me. Don't invite me because I will come. I will be. I will. Oh my gosh, I will totally come. But no,
but that staircase
I interrupted you. Yeah.
Before the film.
Before the movie. Yeah.
Right? So yes, it was grand and the rest of it, but the staircase was it took you from this deck to that deck. It was just a staircase. And now, because of the film, it has completely taken a life of its own. Just when you think about it, it's some stairs.
It's just a stair. I know, and it's a thing. I mean, we stayed at the Titanic Hotel in Liverpool as well, and they have a staircase that's part of their special event space too. And those are the Titanic Hotel. There is in like the old warehouses on the dock, so it is massive. You cannot fathom how big this boat. Like the rooms, the ceilings are so high. We were sort of like, what is going on? But they have a staircase now because they've done their event space with like certain carpeting. Their staircase looks a little odd because I think it's to scale, but it just against the carpet pattern just doesn't look right, in my opinion. Maybe get in trouble with people there. The concierge there is like a friend of mine now, so if John's listening, he's probably mad that I'm saying that. I love you guys, but. Yeah, I think the staircase is like a whole thing now. And I think at Pigeon Forge, it's the main thing. I mean, it's the main thing people come for.
It's in all the advertising. And I think it encapsulates that exactly what I was saying, the sort of the commercialization of Titanic since the film. And I think it's where the kind of debates around the film and the commercialization and remembering the victims, the artifacts, and how you respect the Titanic story all kind of merge into one, because you then have, museums running ghost tours. So, and I just think, I was listening to your episode where you mentioned of sort of about, supernatural activity and this. Sorry, I don't want to talk ill of anyone, but there was this idea that they were claiming there were echoes of a child who died on Titanic.
Well, if you listened, I can't remember if I said it in that episode or if I said it. I did a bonus episode that was a little bit about this too, but we were just sitting on our couch with some, just some popcorn. I'm like, I told my husband, I'm like, you have to watch this I have to watch this to have a full understanding of this, and I just, I'm just sitting there. The pure disbelief I'm experiencing that I think it was Lorraine Allison they were claiming was coming through on this. That's a whole nother layer of ethics and morale. Yeah.
Well, but I think they kind of tie in together, and this is why I was kind of being careful, because I know you work with Branson and Pigeon Forge, but they allowed this to be there. And
they do. Yeah, and they do, and they make money off of it. Yeah.
Well, and they also had one where they were talking about they had an artifact there, and they were talking about Frederick Fleet kind of now looking out over.
Oh my gosh!
Making up for what exactly, as though he is to blame for the Titanic disaster. Like, it just felt to me as though not only are you exploiting the Titanic story, you're placing things that are frankly just, in my opinion, completely absurd because there is no ghost there.
There makes
But also,
I mean,
you're placing
yeah.
immense amount of blame and guilt on someone really unduly, and it's quite offensive. And
It is offensive because never in any of the historiography had I ever come across that even being an argument that people had made. And and my listeners know this. Full disclosure, I love haunted history. Like I've done. That's why I did the supernatural episode, and I used George Behe's book. He researched all of these paranormal quote unquote occurrences of the Titanic. And I did an episode on Captain Smith, and then a segment that I did on that is just a sort of just like go down the laundry list of all of the claims of seeing Captain Smith's ghost all around the world, because that's a thing too. So I really, like, as a historian, it's one of my kind of side projects, is I really love trying to get to the bottom of why certain places are considered quote unquote haunted. Like, that's one of my things. I love that. And I love going to house museums. We were at one here just a couple of weeks ago, took an amazing tour, and then at the end, the guide is like, okay, I know someone's going to ask me about ghosts, so here's the ghost part. But and I think it can be a really great way for, say, a house museum to keep infusions of cash going. There is an interest in paranormal, and it's growing. I think COVID is responsible for another big surge of it. But I think if you're a small house museum and you have a ghost tour on Saturday nights, because that brings in cash, and then that cash allows you to keep your house preserved, I think there's a world in which that's okay. But I think in terms of these Titanic sites capitalizing on ghosts specifically associated with I don't know, I agree, it's a very murky ground.
You're talking about real people that had real lives who were destroyed. I mean, you look at places like Southampton and Belfast and Cove, entire towns were almost wiped out. Like
fathers, like whole streets, like all the fathers are have died.
A brilliant part of the Titanic Museum in Sea City, which is in Southampton, and they have this map of Southampton, and they highlight. You walk over it, so there's a map on the floor, and they highlight every house where someone was affected, and it's basically
it's the whole it's the whole town. And
I think, again, this is sort of my point, is that all this artifact stuff comes into this. Okay, what are we really doing here? Are we just making money, or are we going to try and recount this story and have children learn about this? Have people refresh their memory of, people forget, actually, when you step on a cruise ship today, basically everything you have to do is because of Titanic, all these kind of laws and things that you
muster, like the lifeboat musters and everything.
People kind of forget that is directly linked back to Titanic. So all of that stuff is fair game, and you want to tell that story, but I think the wider kind of commercialization of Titanic, which includes things like ghost tours and includes the artifact.
And the romanticizing of everything. I mean, as much as I love the 97 movie and will die on that hill, I do recognize that that movie has made in many people's minds the Titanic story seem like a romantic thing, which it is not at all. It's chaos and death and families torn apart. And the movie is, I think, responsible for some of that. I mean, people buy The Heart of the Ocean. People buy, there's definitely a conversation to be had there. I understand both sides of that.
I think it has a net benefit. I think, I'm not placing all the blame on James Cameron's Titanic, because I think it had a net benefit on the story of Titanic.
Oh, of course. I
mean, I when I worked at Titanic Belfast, people would often ask about the sinking in particular, because the gallery about the sinking is quite sensitive. It's quite kind of sort of restricted and sort of restrained, sorry. And I would often say, to be honest, I'm not sure we'll ever see a better kind of depiction of just how horrific that sinking was than James Cameron's film. I think
agree.
There are bits of it that, the Murdoch stuff I have a big issue with, but in terms of the violence of that sinking, I know I listened to your episode not long ago about A Night to Remember, and you were talking about sort of like how nice it was. It was a British film, and obviously I'm British, but I actually think that they really undersell how horrendous that sinking was. Kind of like, oh no, the ship's sinking, and like, right, Cameron's film, you really get a sense just.
Oh, it's brutal.
Awful.
It's brutal. And I agree. I think for as it is a net positive, because as much as the Jack and Rose story does take up a lot of real estate in that conversation, if you watch that movie, you get the most realistic interpretation of what that sinking felt like. I took my kids, who at the time were 6 and 7, for the latest re-release in February, and a lot of people sort of looked at us like we were crazy for taking them, but they've already, in my mind, I was thinking they've already seen most of the movie at home in bits and pieces, but when we sat in that theater and they watched the last 45 minutes of that movie, they were very frightened, and I definitely had a parent moment of like, oh gosh, were they ready for this? Should we have done this? Because it is harrowing, it is horrifying, and it is, obviously a wonderfully made action film, but in terms of historical purposes, it's, if you are teaching kids, say middle schoolers, like, about the sinking, you play those last 45 minutes for them to teach them what the sinking was. I mean, it's there. I don't think anybody could ever do a better job of depicting the chaos.
No, but I think that is, you're absolutely right. And I think that is why I sort of say there is a net benefit to that. And certainly the revitalization of Belfast has a lot to thank James Cameron for. But I just think that it is, in the context of the artifacts debate, it is worth noting that there is just that wider commercialization of Titanic, and where do you sit with that is, I suppose, of personal preference. But I don't know. I mean, I certainly land on the position that, we have to tell this story. We should tell this story. It needs to be accurate and truthful and faithful. But it needs to be done in a way, of course, make money. This is not to paint Titanic Belfast as some sort of saint, but for me, I think that on 9 out of 10 occasions, they get that line right. They have on occasion got it wrong, and I have seen them get it wrong and been like, don't know about that.
Yeah, I mean, they're just humans. I mean, no one's going to hit the mark perfectly every time, even with the best of intentions. Nobody is. So, yeah, but absolutely.
But I think that the way they tell their story, I just think is far more faithful and honest than anything RMS Titanic Inc. has done. And I know RMS Titanic Inc. are obviously very successful, apart from the weird moment where they decided to have a bankruptcy moment. But I do think that they just cross that line. And I think that I personally find them a tricky part of my love for Titanic, which is almost endless. But I find it really difficult when you have the debate about Titanic to not bring up the ethics and morals of RMS Titanic Inc., who, as you say, and as we went through the history before, there's basically no reason. They just decided to go down at first. They had the thought to take the money, and that made them the legal owner, and they just have very rarely, if ever, shown any real respect for that story. And I think ultimately on that artifacts debate, that's where I land, is that I just think, even if I was to say, okay, yes, let's take everything we can from the wreck because it's going to be lost, let's lift every single possible thing we can, I would not think that RMS Titanic Inc. is the body to do that.
I agree.
It's really hard to kind of, I know we both agree on this, but like, it is a gravesite, but everything's decaying. So I kind of get pulled in both directions. And certainly my experience of working at Titanic Belfast, meeting Robert Ballard, meeting people who were descendants and all the rest of it, plays a part in my kind of possibly leaning towards leaving it as a gravesite position. But I probably could be persuaded that we should lift things. It just shouldn't be RMS Titanic Inc. that does it.
No, I 100%. On just depending on the day and where my mind is, or what I've been reading, or how I'm feeling, my opinion shifts. In the ways that you just described. But I agree 100% that even if I woke up one day and I decided my My definitive opinion is that definitely we should, my opinion is never going to change again, and we should bring up all the artifacts. What I would want is like a consortium of experts, historians from all walks of life, men, women, racial diversity, I would want a consortium built and put together of true experts and conservationists from all over the world, a truly diverse group of people with actual expertise. And don't even get me started on how this ties in with, especially in the US, just a lack of a loss of a value of expertise. And I think that unfortunately that the US is definitely suffering that across all facets of life. And this is just one example. But yeah, I think if it was a group of people that were put together with the distinct purpose of making sure these artifacts are conserved in the best way possible, and they were on display to the public, maybe even a nonprofit situation, that I think would be ideal for me in a perfect world.
But also that passion for Titanic. I think, you said it in your episode when you were walking around Belfast and you went to Titanic Belfast. You can feel that passion and that affection for Titanic, which sounds strange because you're talking about a ship that sank and 1,500 people died. But you go around Titanic Quarter and every bit of it is thought about and is respectful. And yes, you do have a ride in Titanic Belfast, but even that is respectful.
So well done. It's so beautifully done.
Wait, what? There's a ride? And you go,
yeah, it's
when you go on it, it is, you're not at Disneyland.
I was listening to a podcast months ago and they mentioned it. This person hadn't been to Belfast, and it's flippantly mentioning oh, I can't believe they have a ride. This is so insulting to the Titanic community. No, it's not at all. Go and experience it before you develop an opinion about it. But no, it's so tastefully done. It's so beautifully put together. Students of public history should go to Titanic Belfast, and that should be part of their class, their interactive curriculum. I mean, if you are a student of public history in the area, they should have a field trip day where you go there, and Titanic Belfast walks you through their strategies, how they developed this site, because it is a top-notch public history site, and you can tell that every single bit of it was put together by experts that value Titanic and value Belfast, and that so weird. I don't know if it has anything to do with being down here. I just checked and the recordings look like they've recorded fine, thank goodness, but I'll just have to splice together. I know, I was I lost you, and I was oh gosh, are the recordings okay? But they look good. That's what's great about Squadcast, because it's all cloud.
Yeah.
But let me see if I can splice or say something so I can splice this. Let me get a couple of seconds of silence. Okay. So yeah, I think that in terms of Titanic Belfast, you have, as you mentioned, this is your thought, and I just agree, a perfect representation of how the Titanic story can be told without the artifacts from the wreck, and just with an eye on being part of the community around it, and also telling the story and the history of the place, which, as we talked about earlier, is such an integral part of putting together something like this. And I hate to say it, I think probably need to wrap up, so that I think unfortunately I've got kids making noise upstairs, and then also I want to talk again. I'm already thinking we need a part 2 of this. We probably should wrap up time wise for now, but that leads me into my last question, which is, you're so familiar with Belfast and it's such an important place to you. And like I said, I've only been there once, but I love it and I can't wait to go back. And I really hope one day I might even get to do an event with Titanic Belfast. I would love that. Hopefully we can work that out at some point. It's one of my dreams. But what do you think? Belfast has such a sense of hope, I feel like, in it now. And is that what you feel? And do you have any thoughts on the future of Titanic Belfast or of just Belfast in general and how Titanic Quarter is playing a part in that?
I mean, this is, yeah. You've actually used a word that I was going to use in the answer to this, but I mean, I'm really excited about the future of Belfast. Listen, no one who knows me that listens to this will be in the least bit surprised to hear me say this, but Belfast for me is just the greatest city in the world. It just is, and I won't have another word said on it. But I mean, recent developments in the UK, namely Brexit, sort of pose a risk to that, and we are starting to see the repercussions of that. But I don't want to dwell on that too much, but I would say, I have a very kind of deep love for Belfast, and as you probably know, we celebrated 25th anniversaries this year. So obviously we had one for the greatest one of all time, the one for something called the Good Friday Agreement, which I know you'll know all about, but for your listeners was a really important kind of moment in Belfast's history, which essentially put an end to some pretty unpleasant violence in Northern Ireland. And you talked in your episode about Belfast how confused you were when you went from kilometers per hour to miles per hour, and you were like, it was so weird. And actually it made me laugh so much. I texted my friend and I said, that is a testament to just how well the Good Friday Agreement has worked, because you had no idea that you'd crossed into another country. That's what happened.
Not at all. Yeah.
The only way you know that you have crossed the border from Republic of Ireland to Northern Ireland or vice versa is that it changes from kilometers to miles per hour.
I know, and we were in a car that didn't tell us what, so we had no idea what speed we were going.
Absolutely
no idea. So we just figured if anyone stopped us, we would say, we would do our best Texas accent and just be like, well, we're from Texas. We don't know what we're doing. Just have mercy on us. But yeah, we had no idea what speed we were going. So,
but I think, that is a testament to it. And so earlier this year, I made a documentary to sort of celebrate 25 years of the Good Friday Agreement. And there's a line in this documentary from my friend Debbie. I've written it here because it really is, to me, everything. But she says, it feels like it's finally time for us to come into our own and reach our full potential. Places like London and Edinburgh already had that, but we never really got it before. And every time I show people this documentary, or it's, I'm showing and I'm at the back or whatever, that's the line that always gets me, because it's how I feel. And Belfast really deserves to have its moment. So it's, it's been through so much trauma, and it's come out the other end as a welcoming, as you know, tolerant, diverse, progressive, exciting, vibrant city. And it deserves to be recognised for that. And there really is a future there. The people of Belfast are amazing. And listen, Belfast has a lot of world-class tourism, not just Titanic Belfast.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's, if you're not, I don't think anyone that's not a Titanic person would be listening to this podcast. But but if you are, it's a lot going on. We ventured out. We had some amazing, but we had one of the best meals we've ever had in Belfast.
I was just about to say, they have incredible food. They have unique offerings, unbeatable, stunning scenery. But it is the people of Belfast who are rebuilding their city's image. They are crafting their country's future day by day. And the people of Belfast are unique because, as you said, they are full of hope and optimism. And I think, the hope is that Belfast will be finally kind of allowed to move on from its sort of dreary and unfair image, and optimistic because they're already making it happen. As I said, my friend's story when I first moved there, they're sort of these shining beacons for the rising city that they live in, and the beautiful country they're part of. And I genuinely believe that what they're doing day in, day out is heroic, and they deserve to have their moment. And when it happens, trust me, no one will be ready to say, I told you so, more than me.
Well, now you've been a big part of it, and it's been wonderful to, I did the Belfast episode last year. I sort of was kind of just throwing spaghetti at the wall. Like after spending 3 days there, I had like 3,000 things to say. So I just tried to narrow in on a few things that I'd thought about. And I, will be doing more Belfast episodes in the future. Obviously, this is definitely a Belfast episode. And I think that for me, I want to get back because there's so much more to explore. And for me, and my husband agreed that, when we were on our trip last summer, we went, because it's part of the research I'm doing for my book right now. I mean, we went to so many Titanic sites. We were in Cove, we were in Addergoole, Liverpool, and of all the places that we went, Belfast is if you're a Titanic person, you stand there and it's very emotional. You can connect with the ship and the story more so, I think, than any other place. And it is just it's a beautiful experience. And again, anyone who can afford to, it is so worthwhile to just go and spend a few days there and take Titanic Quarter in, but also take in the city. It's safe. It's beautiful. There's nothing to be afraid of. They embrace the dark and the light of their history, and you can learn about, if you're interested in the history of all of the troubles there, you can learn about it there. I mean, there are tour guides that will take you on those trips as well and walk you through everything that's happened. So
you will not get a better welcome in any other city, in my opinion, than Belfast, because they are so welcoming. And they used to joke that the big yellow cranes that have the H.
Oh yeah.
You may have heard this if you've been to Titanic Belfast, but it used to be a joke we'd always say, which is that it actually stands for hello and welcome, not Holland and Wolf.
Yeah. Talk about iconic. Those cranes are so iconic. And we were staying at the Titanic Hotel. We had a corner room that was looked straight into the Game of Thrones set too. So it was, and we're not huge Game of Thrones people, but we have friends that are. So we were texting these pictures to people that we know, and they were like, "Where are you right now? Why is they had no context to it being some of those sets being in Belfast. So they were like, this doesn't compute. Where are you? But yeah, I agree. I think just, hope and promise of the future. I mean, who knows? I think there's only good things to come. There's a lot of young people there, a lot of brilliant, smart people there, working on, I think, developing lots of different parts of the city. And I, as a traveler, I'm excited to go back and spend more time. And but we've got to do this some more, because I will wrap up for today. Yeah, no, but maybe we can think of another fun angle to take a look at Belfast through Titanic wise. And I think this has been fantastic. Talking to you is so refreshing, and what I'm trying to do with the podcast is open up the conversation in these very modern ways. And I think what Titanic Belfast is doing is at the forefront of it. And I can't thank you enough for talking about it all and telling us about your experiences. And I will make sure to, in the show notes, I'll put your article and also the short film that you were talking about that you sent to me, which is wonderful. And if people are interested in this topic at all in terms of Belfast, they should definitely take I think it's about 15 minutes, right? It's very digestible. So I'll make sure that's in the show notes as well. But thanks for giving Unsinkable all this time. I really appreciate it. This has been fantastic.
No, thank you so much for having me. It's been nice to just get all the Titanic out my system.
Anytime you need to do that, we're good. I'm already thinking I'm sure there's something fun we can maybe do for a bonus episode or something. But and we'll have to find a way to, maybe we can meet up in person and record in person at some point. But yeah, what you're doing for the Titanic community and how you speak of it is really important, and I just feel lucky to know you. So this has been
right back
fantastic. It's a love fest. I already told you, and my listeners know this, I am the most awkward at interview ends, because then this is some behind the scenes for listeners, because then what happens is we stop recording, and then I'll also then say goodbye to my guests, so it's this awkward double goodbye. So yeah, this is signing off with the initial goodbye, and goodbye for listeners. There we go.